Hello, my name's Megan Dennis. I'm curator at Gresson Hall Farm and Workhouse and the current chair of the steering group for the Workhouse Network. The Workhouse Network is a group of heritage and museum sites based in workhouse buildings. Over the last year and a half, we've been engaged in the More Than Oliver Twist project, an amazing research and interpretation project looking at the lives of inmates of workhouses in the 1881 census. In this film, we'll be looking at how researching for More Than Oliver Twist has impacted our volunteers.
And most of the stories that we researched were sad little stories and sort of unfortunate lives in the workhouse. But there was one which I picked out because it's a sort of a rounded story that has at least a satisfactory outcome to it and shows the workhouse sort of delivering and working for the family concerned. This is the story of Catherine and Elijah Doubleday, Charles Doubleday in 1878. She probably came to realise fairly quickly after her marriage that she's married a fairly wild character, because within a few months Charles is up in front of the magistrates on a charge of drunk and disorderly, and features fairly regularly in the local papers with that sort of incident. Their son Elijah is born in 1879, and again Charles continues to appear in court from time to time. But by the middle of 1880, Catherine and Elijah are clearly in the workhouse because Charles is up in front of the magistrates in Southall on the charge of failing to support his wife and child, who were at that time in the workhouse. There's a very interesting court transcript of the case brought by the workhouse, who are attempting to recover the cost of caring for his wife and child in the workhouse. And it ends up with he saying he had no work, he couldn't afford to pay. The workhouse asserting that, well, there was plenty of work in the summer, in the harvest and so on, and you didn't go and find it. Ends up with him being sent down for 2 weeks hard labour. At the end of that, interestingly, he says, well, can I have my wife back when I come out of prison? And the magistrate's answer to that is, if you can support her, I'm sure you can, because clearly the workhouse don't want your wife, they'd be clear to be rid of her. And that shows a sort of attitude, I think, toward how the workhouse works. Time goes by. 10 years later, in the 1891 census, the child Elijah, who's 10 then, he's still in the workhouse, but his mother is out of the workhouse. She's got a job as a charwoman, presumably not earning enough to support her child, which is why he's still in the workhouse, but beginning to emerge at least into life. As far as we can see, Charles at this time is still living a fairly wild life, appearing in the census of no fixed abode, presumably sleeping in a barn somewhere or something of the sort. But over the next 20 years or so, you can trace that this family begins to recover. The sort of start in life they've had in the workhouse sets them off into a path. And by the 1911 census, the three of them are living together again as a family. They're all in employment as agricultural labourers. And some stability has returned to their life, perhaps crediting the workhouse at least with providing a bridge to reach that point. And then some years later, in 1915, Elijah, the son, marries. He has children which go on, and we can actually see that his descendants are still living in the Southall area, which is a rather nice sort of circularity that the workhouse has done. It's rescued a family's life, albeit they suffered the difficult times in the workhouse and the opprobrium of the society at the time. Most of the stories have got some sort of detective, how on earth do you find your way through all the records? And names are recorded improperly. In one case, Elijah is put down as a girl rather than a boy in the census, that sort of thing. So you have to pick your way through all the errors in the records, and that's quite satisfying. But I think I like this story because it was a satisfactory sort of outcome, whereas many of the other cases we recorded were sadly children who died in the workhouse or elderly people who'd got no hope but to survive in the workhouse. I found it interesting meeting other workhouse volunteers from the other sites involved in the Morland Oliver Twist project, talking to one or two of the professional, the historians and the social scientists who were involved in this project. I found interesting in the events. And it's broadened my understanding. It really, when we talk to visitors in the workhouse, it really is useful having a body of real life case studies behind you, with which you can illustrate the things that we talk about to visitors. And I think that was a really useful thing, that having the opportunity to pursue these lives through the Morland Oliver Twist project, that provided to me.
Another volunteer who followed a satisfactory detective story was Belinda May of the Thackeray Museum of Medicine in Leeds.
I'm looking at Thomas and Ellen Bateman, who were in Leeds Union Workhouse in 1881. Thomas was 74 and described as shipbuilder. He was also had been blind for 2 years and was suffering from weakness. His wife, Ellen, was also in the workhouse. She was also 74, but no occupation was listed. During my research, I found out that they had got married on Michaelmas Day in 1830. That's 51 years earlier. And Michaelmas Day is significant because St. Michael was the patron saint of boatmen, and also it was a day of celebration for workers as new contracts were started in September for the following year. So it was a very important day and one that was celebrated widely across the community. 2 weeks later, when he was hauled into court for not providing for his wife, for neglecting Ellen. In court, he said that he'd been tripanned into marriage and that he was drunk. The judge was having none of this. He had married illegally and there was nothing he could do. He'd have to pay out 5 shillings a week for her upkeep. He said, and I'm going to quote here, "What are we going to go to house with? I have no money." And then a good-natured dame called out that she'd sat on a coal bucket for a week until she got something better. And there was much hilarity in the court. So Thomas was ordered to pay 4 shillings a week, but a fortnight later, back he was in court because he still hadn't paid her. But again, the judge said, "We've been through this, it's legal, you're married to her, you've made that decision, it's your responsibility." And Thomas, claiming no money, was sent down to jail, but then his father bailed him out by paying making an arrangement to pay the fees, and so he was released from jail. Now, after this, they stuck together. 9 years later, they had a son, and he also went into boat building, and they spent the rest of their lives together. They worked in different towns from Burnley right through to Leeds, always on the canal. So he must have been building boats to go on the canal, until they became too infirm to be able to work and make their own living. And so at this point, they went into the workhouse. They stayed there until their deaths, which was later the same year, 1881, and they died within 6 months of each other, and they're both buried in Beckett Street Cemetery. Now, this story stood out to me because 2 people who'd been on the list became people, particularly Thomas, because we heard his voice, we heard his argument, and you sort of begin to understand him. But what about Ellen? How did she feel about being publicly embarrassed by being abandoned 2 or 3 days after she'd been married, and then staying with him for the rest of her life? There were women who did separate from their partners and either move in with someone else or fend for themselves in a different way. But they stuck together. And I find it extraordinary that you can get a glimpse into people's lives through looking at records and get a sense of who they are, but also wonder what their lives were like. How difficult was it for them to stay together? And that's why I chose them.
Belinda found the process of researching inmates' lives made them come alive in her imagination. This was the case for many of our volunteers digging into the archives, including Denise Hickman from Gresson Hall.
Ellen Hall was 2 years old in the 1871 census when she and her mother Susan and brother William were at Gresson Hall. A few years later, her mother Susan married somebody called William Cross, so the family went to live in Shipdham. In 1877, sadly, Susan died of childbirth, and a couple of years previous to that, William, Ellen's brother, had died aged 11. Later that year, there was a court case brought against William Cross, who was Susan's husband, over the death of the baby, Edward. It was found that the nurse in charge of the baby, who was a neighbour, had given the baby narcotics. They were both put in prison. A few months after that, in December 1877, the policeman in charge of the superintendent in charge of the case decided to bring proceedings against the pharmacist who had supplied the Fox's lung syrup, because during his investigations, he had interviewed the pharmacist and witnesses, and they had discovered that the syrup did not have the red poison label on it, which was law at the time to label anything that had opium in it or narcotics. So when he interviewed the pharmacist, he had said that he knew that it had opium, but he wouldn't label it like that, because if he labeled his medicine with poison, then he wouldn't sell any of it. So the policeman brought proceedings against him, and so there was a court case in December, and there were many witnesses to say that the label was not correctly put on the medicine. And one of the witnesses was Ellen, who was only 9 years old, and she stood on the witness stand, and she said that she had been asked by the nurse to go and fetch the medicine, and when she got to the pharmacy, it was given to her not by the pharmacist, but by the pharmacist's daughter, and that it definitely did not have the red poison label. The charges against her stepfather and the nurse were dropped, and they were released, and the pharmacist was given the option of a month in prison or a fine, and he took the option of the fine. And Ellen, by 1881, was back in Gresson Hall, but according to the records, she was sent in 1881 to work as an apprentice at a pharmacy in Dereham, and in 1885 she married, and she and her husband had 7 children. They lived in Essex and London, and she lived till she was quite elderly and came back to Norfolk and died in Dereham. So that was a sort of story that for me was important, because when you research children, you don't really get to know much about them because they are so young. And to have her in all the newspapers with her witness statements really did bring her very much to life, and the fact that her childhood was so traumatic, but also the fact that she did actually end up having a happily married life, even though she was widowed reasonably young, but had lots of children around her the rest of her life, her own children. So that was a sort of happy ending, I like to think. I don't know what kind of support she would have had at Gresson Hall, but I think the sort of trauma and bereavement that Ellen went through was probably sadly quite common with a lot of the children there. So it's difficult to tell. I do realise that the lives of the people, the inmates that were in the workhouse at the time, outside the workhouse, was really very miserable. And so, having a place that they had a bed at night and food to eat, and you do feel that not just the children, I think that there was definitely the intention and was always to try and do the best by them. I think it really has been an incredibly sort of learning experience and very rewarding. There's nothing quite like spending quite a lot of time looking for some clues or something to kind of fit in when you start, there's a bit of confusion over something, and then you tie up a loose end. I think it's been a fantastic experience for me, and I've really, really loved it, and I've been very engrossed in the work I've done, and looking forward to doing my next few people. What's really amazing is that everybody has got an interesting story, and it doesn't matter who they are or where they've been or what they've done. Everybody that I have researched has been incredibly interesting.
Denise discovered that everyone has a valid story to tell. Even the poorest lives in the past have a lesson for us to learn from. This is something that was echoed by Roger, who was a volunteer at the workhouse in Southall.
I was quite excited by this. I was new to the workhouse at the time, and I thought the project would be an opportunity to meet with new people and share and learn from them. It was an aspect of history that I'd not actually looked at before, and it was also a part of the country that I'd not got any familiarity with. So the opportunity to look at both the countryside, the places and the people was again something new to me. In terms of doing the research, I was already experienced in doing family history, having done it for over 30 years. And as a result, that held no sort of surprises or fears for me. The thing that I found depressing about the whole project was the level of rural poverty and the way that people ended up in the workhouse, frequently because they were either old and their families couldn't support them, or they were perhaps unmarried mothers whose families had rejected them, and therefore both groups of people were desperate and ended up in the workhouse. Also finding deaths of children in the workhouse wasn't particularly attractive. The encouraging thing was finding some of these people were actually able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, get out and make a success of their lives. Again, typically these were the unmarried mothers who actually got out, got married and started a family with a new husband, and then made a successful life as would be defined by late 19th century and early 20th century. The other thing which I found interesting in that particular situation was the fact that some of the children who had been in there lived to within my lifetime, and therefore if I'd been in the right place at the right time, I could have met them when I was a child and they were old people. It was very good for the lockdown period. As a result, I was able to do a lot of the research at home.
It's amazing to think that workhouse history is so close to us all, just a matter of a few generations. This is something that Judy Jones from Ripon also found.
I did a case study on a family with Elizabeth Mudd, the mother of the children, and 4 children in Ripon Workhouse. Elizabeth Mudd had been born in London. She married a soldier, William Mudd, from 1881, when Elizabeth was in the workhouse with the 4 children. William Mudd stayed in the army and he died, and he left a sum of £103 to Elizabeth, his wife, and that would have been the value of £8,000 in today's money. In the 1891 census, Elizabeth was still living in Ripon. She was living off her own means, so obviously the money from the will had come in useful. She was living with her eldest son, William, who was a shoemaker's apprentice, her 3rd son, Jessie, who was a news vendor, and the youngest child, Elizabeth, who was a scholar. Her 2nd son, Thomas, was at the Gordon Boys' Home, Cobham in Surrey. We could find no further record of Elizabeth herself or of her death following the 1891 census. I found this case study very interesting. The fact that Elizabeth and her husband in the army had their first 3 children, obviously at army camps, and then Elizabeth making her way from Devon all the way up to Ripon, Yorkshire, with 3 little children at that stage, to have her 4th baby here in this area. Elizabeth was very persistent in getting most that she possibly could out of the workhouse system. Elizabeth made sure her children were educated. She worked hard to bring the children up to be successful and useful members of local society. I think from the point of view of doing the research, it was quite time consuming, and also it made me realise just how important this sort of information was from the point of view of social care and the welfare of families in need, and really how much they depended on the poor law relief of the workhouse system.
Many of our volunteers uncovered surprising stories and had their preconceptions about the workhouse challenged, something that Sarah Reed from Southall also discovered.
Well, my first lot of research was the whole family of 4 children that ended up in the workhouse with no parents. So my first question was to find out why. Why were they there? And from there, I went on to finding out about all 4 of them. But one of them stood out as having a slightly more interesting life than the others. That was Joseph Duckenfield. After the workhouse, he first of all worked on 2 different farms in the same locality, and then I lost him completely. I couldn't find him anywhere in that locality. It turned out he'd moved to Sheffield, to West Yorkshire and Sheffield, and there he had started working on the railways as a signalman, and he joined a union. So I found quite a lot of information about him.
Searching through Joseph's military history, Sarah was lucky enough to find an accurate physical description of him.
He was only 5'2" tall, which is actually very short for a man. And then later on, you lose them completely after any war records. I couldn't find anything about him until he died, again in Sheffield, just before the Second World War. He died in 1939.
Sarah was lucky enough to be able to picture Joseph from the physical descriptions in his military records. Whilst we aren't able to see photographs or images or pictures of most of the inmates that we research, it is clear that this project has provided us with strong personal links to the past. It's increased our understanding of the role of the workhouse. It's improved our family and local history research skills and enabled us to publish an amazingly diverse and engaging series of biographies that demonstrate that workhouse inmates were very much more than Oliver Twist.